Is the link that was sent out yesterday.
The show meeting invitation. They are on this bottom.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. My name is Abdullah Hajat and I belong to the Talimi Department of the Jamiatul Ulama South Africa. Under this arm of the organization, we try our level best to assist in staff development of Asatiza, Muallimin and Muallimat at various institutes, which includes Muslim schools as well as Makatib. Alhamdulillah, we have approximately 135 to 140 institutes affiliated to us, and we have 7 supervisors who go around in trying to fulfill this responsibility. It gives me great pleasure to welcome all our participants this morning to this series of Zakat webinars where the Muftis from our Fatwa department will share their wealth of knowledge for the broader good of the community. Given the fact that we are currently facing this pandemic, and I'm sure that all of you will agree with me that these are very uncertain times, as a result of which we could not afford ourselves the privilege of having all our presenters as envisaged. However, we are fortunate to have at least one who will acquaint us with the laws of Zakat. Mufti Muhammed Haffejee is our presenter for this morning, and Mufti Saab manages the economics and finance desk within the Darul Ifta. In terms of his background, which I think is very important for us to know, that after successfully memorizing the Quran-e-Kareem in Madrasa Islamiyya Benoni, more famously known as the BMJ, Mufti Muhammad Saab went on to pursue his Alim Fadil studies at Jamia Darul Ulum Karachi under the tutelage of Justice Mufti Muhammad Taqi Uthmani. Mufti Saab holds a BA Honours in Semitic Languages and Culture from the University of Johannesburg and a BCom degree in Private Law and Economics from the University of South Africa. After being awarded a scholarship to pursue postgraduate studies in Islamic finance, Mufti Muhammad Saab went on to successfully complete a Master of Science degree in Islamic finance with specialization in research for Islamic finance using econometric techniques. He lectures Islamic commercial law at various higher learning institutions in South Africa and features regularly on media platforms. His exposure in managing the economics and finance desk of the Jamiatul Ulama South Africa has allowed him to gain more than a decade of experience in teaching and consulting businesses and corporations on matters Sharia, finance, and economics. Before I hand over to Mufti Saab, just a few housekeeping rules. Questions and answers will be handled at the end of the presentation or as called for by Mufti Muhammad Saab. If you encounter any technical issues such as sound or visibility of slides, then kindly use the chat function. During the Q&A session, kindly use the raise hand function for ease of the administration process on our side. I will repeat that. During the Q&A session, kindly use the raise hand function for ease of the administration process on our side. That's it from me. I now hand you over to Mufti Muhammed Haffejee, who will run you through the Zakat webinar.
Jazakallah Maulana Abdullah for that introduction. Alhamdulillah, alhamdulillahi asta'inuhu wa astaghfiruhu wa a'udhu billahi min shururi anfusina wa min sayyiati a'malina. Man yahdihillahu fala mudilla lahu wa man yudlilhu fala hadiya lahu. Wa ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wahdahu la sharika lahu wa ashhadu anna sayyidana wa maulana Muhammadan abduhu wa rasuluh. Amma ba'd, qala Allah ta'ala fi kitabihi al-mubin. والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر صدق الله العظيم رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم. Respected audience, it gives us joy and pleasure to know that our constituency are keen to discover the laws of Zakaah and improve and enhance their personal implementation of and fulfillment of this injunction of the Sharia. In the interest of time, I will most probably go straight to the 10 most frequently asked questions by Muslim sisters. While we wait for a few more individuals to join us, there will be a short introduction, inshallah. But before that, allow me to state that the purpose of this particular webinar is geared towards addressing the 10 most frequently asked questions by Muslim sisters. The benefit of the service provided by the Jamiatul Ulama South Africa Fatwa Department is that any individual is allowed to or free to access these services, even though the individual may choose to remain anonymous. So under this cloak of anonymity, we've been able to gather some of the most frequently asked questions by Muslim sisters in the hope that by addressing these 10 questions or responses to these 10 questions in a proactive way, it would eliminate more people having to call the office and rather have the information on hand in order to do the right thing in terms of calculation of Zakaah. At the very outset, I'm just displaying our contact details simply because we may not be able to encompass every scenario in terms of Zakaah calculation or particular difficulties that individuals encounter. So these details will be presented later on again, inshallah, for those who join us a little later. But for now, if you require to take down these notes or these details, please feel free to do so. Our office is available during office hours, obviously. We have a panel of no less than 5 muftis who are on call on a day-to-day basis to respond to individuals, as I mentioned earlier on, even though individuals prefer to be anonymous, and we advise individuals to remain anonymous as far as possible and seek assistance in their dini matters. In the coming few slides, I will be addressing these questions rather from a Hanafi fiqh perspective primarily. Where necessary, and if necessary, I will address the viewpoint of the Shafi'i madhab, inshallah. In terms of an introduction, we have 2 sections. Our first section is basically a section where we outline the benefits of paying Zakaah. And section 2 is the section where we address the 10 most frequently asked questions to our Fatwa department in terms of Zakaah. Commencing with section 1, where we take a look at the benefits of Zakaah. The purpose of this section is, as the word states, to highlight the benefits so that we realize that this injunction of deen is not a penalty. It is not a burden. There are inherent benefits to one and all if this particular injunction is fulfilled according to the dictates of the Quran and the Sunnah of Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So the first category of benefit is the benefit that accrues to the payer of Zakaah. The first benefit to the payer of Zakaah is that Zakaah establishes a superior level of subservience to Allah Ta'ala. What we mean by this is that we all strive hard, we make effort to acquire sustenance and to acquire our wealth. But when we subject our wealth to Zakaah, we are conveying a message to Allah Ta'ala that ultimately we are His bondsmen and our wealth truly does not belong to us. It belongs to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and by virtue of it being truly the property of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we are willing to submit a portion of our wealth for the benefit of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and for the creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So each injunction of deen is geared towards developing that connection and enhancing that connection between bondsman and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So in the case of salah, our bond with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tends to weaken, and as a result we require it more frequently, as opposed to the injunction of Hajj, where if an individual visits the Haramain, and may Allah ta'ala grant us all the tawfiq and the ability, then the heart is already attached to the Haramain, and the obligation once is sufficient to develop that connection between bondsman and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Another benefit that accrues to the payer is that when an individual subjects his or her wealth to Zakaah, it is a symbol that the individual is grateful and is willing to express gratitude for the blessing of wealth. For indeed, without wealth, we would not be able to fulfill our needs and the needs of our families. It is only through wealth that we can do this, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives it to whoever He pleases in whichever quantity He pleases. And when an individual subjects their wealth to Zakaah, it is a mark of gratitude for the blessing of wealth. The third benefit that accrues to the payer is that it purifies the soul from attachment to wealth. Let's face it, as human beings, we strive hard for our wealth, and we are indeed attached to our wealth. Many of us are attached to our wealth in varying degrees. But to ensure that that level of attachment to our wealth is kept in check and under control, we subject our wealth voluntarily and willingly to Zakaah, simply to rid our souls and our hearts from a deep sense of attachment to wealth. Another benefit that accrues to the payer is that when an individual pays their Zakaah, it signifies that the individual is able to identify and empathize with those who are less fortunate. It is a symbol that the payer of Zakaah is indeed compassionate. The heart is still soft, and this is why the individual is willing to part with a portion of their wealth for the benefit of those who are less fortunate. The fifth benefit that accrues to the Zakaah payer is that we live in a world where interest is widespread, and not only interest, different forms of gaining wealth in an illicit way is common. And as a result, no individual can lay claim to the fact that their wealth is clean and untainted. So in the words of Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he's reported to have said that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has placed these injunctions on your wealth to purify your wealth. Because a time will come when no individual, before Qiyamah, a time will come when no individual will be free of interest or any other ill-gotten gain. So the paying of Zakaah is indeed of benefit to the payer first, at least in these 5 ways, among many other ways. To the recipient, Zakaah alleviates poverty and facilitates the fulfillment of needs. Indeed, those who are less fortunate do require resources to fulfill their needs. And Zakaah is best geared towards assisting those who are less fortunate to fulfill their legitimate needs. Zakaah is of benefit to the recipient because it removes ill feelings that the poor or less fortunate tend to entertain towards those who possess means. If you think about a life of a family member, where two individuals, two siblings, one is wealthy, the other is not very wealthy and is a bit impoverished rather. When the wealthy one flaunts wealth and is extravagant in their ways, without considering the sibling who is less fortunate, then the one who is less fortunate harbors those feelings that my own brother or my own sister cannot share with me, and they can enjoy particular luxuries which can be done without, whereas I cannot even have basic needs fulfilled. So this is the very same thing that goes through the hearts and minds of those who are less fortunate. When you and I flaunt our wealth, whether it be the type of branded apparel we choose, or the motor vehicles we choose, or the type of homes we choose to reside in, or the way in which we choose to decorate those homes, these are all measures which harbor ill feelings in the hearts of those who are less fortunate towards those who are fortunate and possess wealth. So when zakah is paid, in some way it is a measure of relief to those individuals who are less fortunate, in terms of allaying those ill feelings which may be entertained in the heart or mind. To society, when zakah is paid, then it bridges the gap between the rich and the poor. In the words of Nabi sallallahu alayhi wasallam, in an authentic hadith mentioned in Majma' al-Zawaid, it is mentioned that if zakah were to be paid correctly in the true sense of the word, then there would be no problem, there would be no poverty. There would not be an impoverished individual. The mere fact that we see impoverished individuals around us is an indication that while zakah may be paid, it is possible that it is not being paid adequately, and it is not being channeled in the appropriate direction or in the appropriate manner for best impact or for optimum benefit. And this is why we find the poverty problem is so rampant, with South Africa being one of the most severe countries in terms of income inequality. To society, zakah develops brotherhood and sisterhood between various strata of society. As I mentioned earlier on, and I won't labor on the point, that when zakah is discharged correctly, those who are less fortunate begin to manage those feelings, those ill feelings which tend to prevail when they observe those who are fortunate flaunting wealth on a regular or day-to-day basis. We now come to section 2, which is the thrust of our webinar for today. And what I would like to state at the very outset of section 2 is that the responses to the first 5 questions are slightly more detailed than the responses to the latter 5 questions. The central theme in our webinars throughout this year has been that zakah is extremely simple. However, it is made complicated simply by the way in which we as individuals are choosing to lead complicated lives. I'll say that again, zakah is extremely simple, but by individuals leading complicated lives, the simple topic of zakah becomes complicated. If this message can be driven home, we have achieved our objective, that we need to strive and endeavor to make sure that as parents, we try our level best to lead simple lives, and lives which are not complicated. As they say, simplicity is the highest form of sophistication. Simplicity is indeed the highest form of sophistication. Today it's become fancy to lead a complicated life, but as Muslims, in terms of the teachings of the Quran and the Sunnah of Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam, we are taught time and time again to lead simple lives. As you'll notice, I will be overlooking for now the virtues pertaining to zakah, and I have done this purposely, realizing that anyone who expresses interest in these webinars has already realized that zakah is an important obligation and it needs to be fulfilled correctly. As a result, I leave the virtues for personal reading. The best, or one of the best resources I can refer listeners to or participants to is the Fadail Sadaqat, authored by Sheikh Muhammad Zakaria rahimahullah. Question number 1. can you simplify zakah for me? This is a very common question that is received by our fatwa department. In terms of simplifying the topic of zakah, this question could stem from a number of sources. Either the individual may not have attended an elementary school or madrasa where they learned how zakah is calculated, or the individual may have attended, but the knowledge has escaped the individual. Or sometimes we all go through primary forms of learning, but as we progress in life, as we grow older, we realize and we start to mature around that particular form of information that we were exposed to. And this is why we only begin to truly appreciate these basic teachings later on in our lives. There's nothing wrong with it. It's perfectly fine as long as before our eyes close, we realize the importance of these injunctions and try our level best to fulfill them. So in terms of zakah, this is as simple as zakah can get. Not these equations, but this particular equation is as simple as zakah is. We're basically taking our zakatable assets on the one hand, particular assets that the Sharia recognizes, and then we're deducting our liabilities. It's a particular quantity of liabilities that can be deducted. When we make this deduction, we arrive at our net zakatable wealth. This net zakatable wealth is the amount that we multiply by 2.5%. Ideally, we should be using 2.5%, which is stipulated in the hadith of Nabi sallallahu alayhi wasallam. However, in exceptional circumstances where an individual happens to be using the Gregorian calendar for calculation, then a body of scholars have agreed that the individual should then utilize 2.57% as a measure, as a fraction to calculate their zakah. In this particular equation, once we arrive at our net zakatable wealth, if the net zakatable wealth is exceeding the nisab rate, it's more than the nisab rate or equal to the nisab rate, then zakah will be payable by the individual. However, if the net zakatable wealth is less than the nisab rate, it does not exceed the nisab rate, then zakah is not payable. Now, this is basically as simple as zakah can get. In terms of further simplifying zakah, we need to understand the nisab. I won't go into too much detail. I'll just suffice on saying that these are the rand equivalents. In terms of weight, from the hadith of Nabi sallallahu alayhi wasallam, we know that Nabi sallallahu alayhi wasallam mentioned 20 dinars of gold as a nisab of gold. That equates to 87.48 grams of gold. And Nabi sallallahu alayhi wasallam mentioned silver as a nisab rate, 200 dirhams of silver. These 200 dirhams of silver equate to 612.36 grams of silver in today's time. In terms of rand equivalents, as at the 29th of March, not the current rates, the rand equivalent of these nisabs of gold calculates to 73,524 rand. And the nisab of silver is calculated as 8,055 rand. So as you see from here, it appears that we have two nisabs. But if you think about it and contemplate a bit deeply, this is not two nisabs. We only have one nisab. The reason why we have one nisab is because in the time of Nabi sallallahu alayhi wasallam, there was the bimetallic standard prevailed in terms of currency. There was gold in circulation, there was silver in circulation. And the ratio of difference between this gold figure that you see in terms of grams versus the silver amount in terms of grams is a ratio of 1:10. So if the ratio of 1:10 applies, what we're basically saying is 1 dinar of gold in the time of Nabi sallallahu alayhi wasallam had equal purchasing power to 10 dirhams of silver. Essentially, what that means is the nisab is 1. We don't have two nisabs. It may appear as two nisabs, but we actually effectively have only one nisab, simply because 1 dinar of gold at the same and equal purchasing power as 10 dirhams of silver. That's as far as nisab is concerned. What I need to do here is elaborate on the three scenarios that can prevail in the life of any individual. So the first scenario is that if an individual only possesses gold, only gold as a zakah asset class and nothing else, no cash, no investments, nothing else, only gold, In that case, the nisab or the quantity of gold that needs to be in possession of to attract zakah must exceed 87.48 grams of gold. Similarly, the second scenario is that if an individual only possesses silver as a zakatable asset, then the quantity of silver in their possession would need to exceed 612.36 grams of silver in order to attract zakah. The third scenario is the most common scenario, where an individual has small quantities of silver, small quantity of gold, small quantity of cash. In this case, the values of all these zakah asset classes would be clustered, and we would utilize the silver nisab rate. If the value of that cluster of wealth is equal to or exceeding the silver nisab rate of 8,055 rand, then zakah would be payable. This third scenario is the most common one. In terms of zakatable assets, I'll just list them without going into detail of each one. So if you think about the equation, on the first item we had was the zakatable assets. That will comprise of cash, receivables, any credit given to an individual and that individual has to pay back. Gold and silver would form a zakatable asset. Stock in trade, anything intended for resale, primarily intended for resale. Any voluntary investment in zakatable assets, agricultural produce, and livestock. This is basically the list of zakatable assets that would need to be considered for zakah purposes. There are two asterisks on the last two bullet items, simply because these two zakat asset classes apply to a very few individuals, and if they do apply to anyone, I usually appeal that they contact me privately so that we can go into the detail of calculation. But this is very much the list of zakatable assets in a nutshell. The non-zakatable assets comprise of precious items that are not for resale. No matter how precious they may be, it may be a precious stone, a diamond, or any other precious stone. But if it's not for resale, it would not have to be subjected to zakah. Then, money which is out of circulation. I just want to emphasize, it's money which is out of circulation. It does not have buying power. A stamp collection, an art collection, these may be extremely valuable, but they do not have to be subjected to zakah simply because they do not meet the Sharia requirement or the classical fiqh requirement of what qualifies as a zakatable asset. The personal residence does not qualify as a zakatable asset. Any other immovable property, an individual may have a holiday home in another province or in another part of the world maybe. That holiday home itself would not have to be subjected to zakah. The rental income is what would be subjected to zakah. Vehicles, furniture, fixtures and fittings, these are not subjected to zakah. Impermissible wealth, it should go without saying that impermissible wealth is exempt from zakah, and no Muslim should ideally be in possession of it. But if it happens to be in possession of anyone, it could be interest money accrued on a bank account of some sort. In that case, the impermissible wealth would not have to be subjected to zakah. Non-gold, silver jewelry, imitation jewelry, in other words, does not have to be subjected to zakah. If an individual has a surplus amount in an excess bond, say, example, they were supposed to be paying or scheduled to be paying 7,000 or 8,000 Rand a month towards a home loan, and they voluntarily lodged 10,000 Rand a month. So the difference between what was required to be paid and what they actually paid is regarded as an excess amount which the individual can withdraw if they want to. From a Sharia and fiqh perspective, there seems to be consensus on this view, at least locally among the muftis, that zakah is not due on a surplus amount which is lodged in an excess bond. Any collateral, if an individual is renting property and has lodged an amount as a deposit, that collateral would not have to be subjected to zakah. In terms of current liabilities, now we're moving on to the second phase of the zakah equation. We're done with assets, zakatable assets, non-zakatable assets. In terms of current liabilities, any short-term expenses for the current month, example, your rent for the current month, telephone bill, school or madrasa fees, or in the case of a university, it would be the current semester's fee, whichever amount is due for the current period in which zakah is being calculated. That amount can be deducted. If there are any long-term liabilities, 12 months of those repayments can be deducted, not the full outstanding amount in terms of the long-term liability, only 12 months of the installment. So you take your monthly installment, multiply by 12, that's the particular amount of liability that can be deducted. Any other debt which is payable within 12 months would need to, or can be deducted. As I say, it can be deducted if an individual chooses not to deduct. It is perfectly in order, in which case they are paying more zakah, and that is meritorious and recognized in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, inshallah. Unpaid zakah of past years, if the individual has outstanding zakah, then we do have a formula to calculate the past zakah. We've got rates up to 1974, dating as far back as 1974. And the zakah of unpaid zakah of past years can be deducted from the current calculation, simply because if those were to be deducted, they would not be in one's possession. Or if those were to be paid on time, they would not have been in one's possession. Legally prescribed debt, if an individual has any type of legally prescribed debt, this can be deducted. From a South African legal point of view, basically, if the creditor has not pursued the debtor for a period of 3 years, then the debtor, whenever the creditor claims the amount, the debtor can raise a defense that the debt is prescribed and hence the creditor has no leg to stand on and the amount is not due. From a Sharia perspective, the passage of time does not absolve an individual from outstanding debt. And as a result, if an individual, if a Muslim individual is debted and they have a scenario of legally prescribed debt, then this amount can be deducted from their zakatable assets. Personal or casual loans between relatives, sometimes between husband and wife, there may be a casual loan between father and child, there may be a casual loan, but in that particular scenario, the full loan can be deducted from the zakatable assets. If an individual is just paying a monthly installment and it's extending beyond a year, that repayment plan, then the monthly installment multiplied by 12. Any account that is in arrears, the full amount is due, and hence the full amount can be deducted as a current liability. Accrued expenses, any expenses which have been incurred but not yet paid to the relevant creditor or individual, these also can be deducted from current liabilities. Question number 2 is, how do I determine my zakah assessment date? This is a very common question, and the first misconception that prevails in terms of an assessment date is that zakah is payable in Ramadan. This is a misconception. Zakah is payable 1 year after possessing surplus zakatable wealth after deducting liabilities. So that 1 year after possessing surplus zakatable wealth after deducting liabilities can potentially be in any other Islamic month. It does not have to be in the month of Ramadan. So you have a case where an individual possesses surplus zakatable wealth after becoming baligh on, let's say, the first of, let's take the 5th of Rabiul Awwal as an example. So they've got wealth. 1 year later, on the 5th of Rabiul Awwal, we would need to determine the asset position. If the individual is in possession of surplus zakatable wealth after deducting liabilities, then zakah would be payable. So in essence, what we're saying is, what I can summarize the determination of a zakah assessment date in the following rule. The rule is that the individual would need to look at the beginning of their zakat year and the end of their zakat year. If at both points the individual is in possession of surplus zakatable wealth after deducting liabilities, then zakah would be payable on all their wealth, even though there may have been a fluctuation in wealth during the year. The only time this 1 year rule would not apply is where the individual sustained a net loss and has absolutely no wealth. In that case, the zakah year will be, so to say, broken and will recommence when the individual is once again in possession of surplus zakatable wealth. So what I've done is I've produced 5 slides to demonstrate this point, just to make it clear that we understand a zakah assessment period. In this first slide, what we demonstrate is that if you look at these red bars, the red bar basically represents the nisab rate, which is fluctuating throughout the year. The green bars represent zakatable assets that are in possession of an individual. As you can see, this individual, in this particular example, on the 1st of Shaban, 1441, on the extreme left, that individual is in possession of surplus zakatable wealth in the beginning of the year. During the year, the wealth is fluctuating. It is going above, and it remains above the nisab rate. But at the end of the zakah year, on the 1st of Shaban, 1442, the individual is still in possession of surplus zakatable wealth. So in this case, if you truly analyze it, on the 1st of Jamadul Ukhra, 1442, on the second last bar from your right, the individual didn't have that wealth for 12 months. But zakah is still payable, simply because we're looking at the beginning of the zakah year as well as the end of the zakah year. And if at both points the individual is in possession of surplus zakatable wealth, zakah is payable. Hence, in this scenario, zakah would be payable. In the second scenario, we have a case where the individual commences their zakah year with wealth exceeding the nisab rate. The end of the zakah year with wealth exceeding the nisab rate. During the year, there's a fluctuation in wealth to such an extent that the wealth even goes below the nisab rate. This does not necessarily affect the zakah year. The assessment date still remains the 1st of Shaban every year. And in this case, zakah would still be payable simply because the beginning of the year and the end of the year was in a position where there was zakatable wealth above the nisab rate. So in this case as well, zakah remains payable. In the third scenario, we have an individual whose zakah year was the 1st of Shaban in the past. They started their year on the 1st of Shaban, 1441, with wealth below the nisab rate. And they ended off their zakah year on the 1st of Shaban, 1442, with wealth exceeding the nisab rate. In this case, because the individual did not possess surplus zakatable wealth in the beginning of the year and only possessed zakatable wealth above the nisab rate at the end of the year, in this case, zakah would not be payable for this particular year. Only 1 year later, which is not represented now on the chart, on the 1st of Shaban, 1443, if the individual is now in possession of surplus zakatable wealth, zakah would be payable. Because on the 1st of Shaban, 1442, there was surplus zakatable wealth, hence 1443 would also be zakatable wealth. So in this case, for this particular year, zakah would not be payable. It's only payable 1 year later. In the fourth scenario, we have an individual who in the past had the 1st of Shaban as their zakatable year or zakat assessment date. But in this particular year, this period, 1441 to 1442, the individual in the beginning of the year as well as the end of the year did not possess surplus wealth exceeding the nisab rate, surplus zakatable wealth exceeding the nisab rate. In this case, zakah would not be payable simply because in the beginning of the year as well as the end of the year, there was no zakatable wealth that is exceeding the nisab rate after deducting liabilities. In this case, zakah is not payable for the current period. The fifth and final scenario is where we have an individual whose zakah year is the 1st of Shaban, 1441, commencing with zakatable wealth exceeding the nisab rate. And that same condition prevails at the end of the year where the zakatable wealth is exceeding the nisab rate. But it so happened that the individual sustained a net loss on the 1st of Safar, 1442. This individual sustained a net loss, and as a result, their zakah year is, so to say, broken and will only have to be reassessed on the 1st of Rabiul Thani, 1443. And this is because if you look at the current graph, on 1442, 1st of Rabiul Thani, 1442, the individual found themselves once again in a surplus position after deducting liabilities. The wealth is exceeding the nisab rate. 1 year later, they would now assess their position on the 1st of Rabiul Thani, 1443, and pay zakah accordingly. So the zakah year of Shaban has broken, and 1st of Rabiul Thani is now the new year. As you can see, these 5 graphs demonstrate that not everything has to be in one's possession for the full year. It is possible that wealth may not be in possession of an individual for a full 12 months, but zakah is still payable, as you see in this particular scenario, or even in this scenario. Zakah would be payable even though the wealth may not have been in possession for 12 precise months. The next question is, how do I calculate zakah on my gold or silver jewelry? This is simple also, and I'll demonstrate now as best as I can, inshallah. Gold in any form is zakatable. It can be in a utensil, it can be a jewelry item, it can be a coin, a gold coin, but in any form. From the Hanafi fiqh point of view, it is zakatable. From a Shafi'i fiqh point of view, if the gold is a jewelry piece and is purely intended for usage on a regular basis, then it is exempt from zakah. But in terms of zakah on jewelry, this is the most common question. And to analyze or to assess zakah on jewelry, there are basically 3 questions that one needs to ask. First of all, is it gold or is it not gold? It will be regarded as gold if it is 14 karat and above. So it's 14, 18, 21, 22, and 24. If it is any of these 5 carats, then it would be constituted as gold and hence subjected to zakah. That's question number 1. Question number 2 is, what's the carat value? The carat value fluctuates on a day-to-day basis, and we derive these values from the rand refineries on a day-to-day basis. We exclude VAT and provide these rates on our website, and also provide it to Radio Islam International. The third question is, how many grams of that particular gold do you possess? That's basically the 3 questions that need to be asked for determining zakah on gold. Here's an example to demonstrate and to illustrate, make it a bit easier. In step number 1, what we've done is we have an individual who possesses 30 grams of 22 karat gold. And we've determined that hypothetically the rate of 22 karat per gram is 584 rand and 52 cents. So we're basically taking the rate of 22 karat, multiplying it by the number of grams, and the result we get is 17,535 rand 60 cents. This is an approximate value of the gold. It may not be the amount the individual would get if they go to a jeweler or try to trade it in, but for zakah purposes, it suffices as a measure of the value of the wealth. In step number 2, we basically take the amount that we arrived at in step 1, multiply by 2.5, and we arrive at our result of zakah that must be paid. It's 438 rand and 39 cents. The same applies to silver. We need to apply the value of the silver per gram, determine how many grams we have. When we arrive at the result is what we multiply by 2.5%. Another common question related to this is when zakah, when you have a jewelry item that is with a precious stone. In this particular scenario, you only pay zakah on the gold content, not on the market value of the item with the precious stone. Zakah is only payable based on the gold or silver content in the particular item. This is a common question for many individuals who are involved in business. It may come across as something strange that we're addressing a zakah on business, but many women, as we understand from a Sharia perspective, and theoretically speaking, they are allowed to be active economic units. The Sharia tolerates it. However, it is within particular confines and particular boundaries. As long as those confines or boundaries are adhered to, it is permissible for a female to be engaged in a commercial endeavor of sorts. So this is a common question. How do I calculate zakah on my business? For those individuals who are involved in service-based business, in that case, zakah would only be due on the cash on hand, whatever cash reserves are on hand, as well as the debtors, individuals who owe money for services that have been provided, as long as those debtors are not written off as bad debt. But the prevailing scenario we receive is the scenario of pure retail trade. And this is why I'll just go into it as quickly as possible. We're firstly looking at bank deposits and petty cash in the business that needs to be subjected to zakah. Trade receivables, if you've sold anything and expecting payment, as long as it's not written off as bad debt, it would need to be subjected to zakah. Loan receivables, you granted a loan to some friend or family member or even a customer, as long as it's not written off as bad debt, it would need to be subjected to zakah. Packaging material, if any, would need to be subjected to zakah. Raw material also needs to be subjected to zakah. In this case, I may need to just elaborate a little bit on the raw material scenario, because from a classical fiqh point of view, our fuqaha have stated that they differentiate between different types of raw material. So if the raw material is visible in the finished product, then the raw material needs to be subjected to zakah. If the raw material is not visible in the finished product, even though it may be make or break in terms of its as an ingredient, it would not have to be subjected to zakah simply because it is not visible in the finished product. So this differentiation does exist in our classical fiqh books and needs to be taken into consideration. If there are any questions on it, I'll field them at a later stage, inshallah. Stock on hand intended for resale, primarily intended for resale, this would need to be subjected to zakah. Further on, in terms of zakah on a business, cash, zakah is payable on all cash in one's ownership. Whether the cash is a saving for a car or to buy a house, but the car or home is not yet purchased, there's no transaction, it's just a pure saving. Any saved rental income would need to be subjected to zakah. Any saved portion of investment dividends would need to be subjected to zakah. The capital portion of a, sorry. Okay. I see there's a question that please advise if a recording of the session will be shared. Unfortunately, I need to leave. We will endeavor to prepare a recording. At this stage, it is uncertain, but if we do manage to get it right, it will be circulated to our participants, inshallah. Zakah is due on petty cash at home as well as savings in a bank account. It doesn't mean it's in a bank account, it's not subjected to zakah. Zakah is due on all currencies in one's possession. In this case, if an individual has, let's say, maybe US dollars in their possession, they could either pay 2.5% of the dollars itself. So if they have $200, then they're paying $2.50 as zakah, or they could determine the current market value of the dollars as at zakah becoming due, and then pay 2.5% of that. Any share in a partnership. Why I'm referring to this one is because a large part of the questions I receive relate to the scenario where a husband and wife are in a partnership. In this case, the first thing to keep in mind is that the zakah dates of the individuals could differ. It does not necessarily mean that because they are in partnership, their zakah date is calculated on the same, their zakah is calculated as at the same date. It's possible that the husband could have a separate date and their wife could have a separate zakah date, depending on when they first came into possession of surplus zakatable wealth. So in the case of a partnership, it would only be due on the individual partner's portion of assets and the individual partner's portion of liabilities. So we're taking the portion of liabilities of the particular partner, deducting it from the portion of assets, and then working out 2.5% of zakah. There is a comment that the slides are not showing on the screen. I'm not sure if this is for everyone. You may be able to just, if you just refresh your screen or leave and come back into the webinar, you should be able to see the screen or the slides. I will be addressing the aspect of zakah on stock in trade in terms of the particular value. And I hope this answers the question. Zakah should be valued at retail price, excluding VAT. not at cost. There seems to be consensus on this, at least locally. I haven't explored internationally, but locally, among the vast majority of scholars, if not all of them, zakah is payable on the marked retail price, excluding VAT. If goods do not have a retail price or relatively certain market value, then any other proxy can be used to determine the current market value. If an individual has goods in progress, the goods will be valued on the stage of progress. So if 70% of the goods are prepared, then 70% of the value would need to be considered for zakah purposes. The aspect of lay-by goods or even consignment goods, this depends on the Sharia characterization of the transaction. If the transactions are regarded as complete as at the day of enacting the lay-by transaction, this means that the goods are no longer belonging to the seller. They actually belong to the buyer or the customer. And in this case, the lay-by goods itself would not have to be subjected to zakah simply because the transaction is done. However, if the transaction is classified as a transaction to be done in the future, when the last payment is made, until that last payment is not made or effected, those lay-by goods would need to be subjected to zakah as stock in trade in the hands of the seller. Dead stock or defective stock remains zakatable as at the current market value. And I already elaborated on the scenario of raw materials. In the business case, any intangibles which are not developed or sourced for trade, like copyrights, patents, trademarks, and software, these would not have to be subjected to zakah. If there's any property, plant, and equipment, this would also not have to be subjected to zakah. Capital or fixed goods, you've got a fixed property maybe that you're trading from, that would not have to be subjected to zakah. Fixtures and fittings also exempt from zakah. Collateral, as I mentioned earlier on, does not have to be subjected to zakah. And bad debt, which has been written off as bad debt, there's absolutely no hope of recovering, would not have to be subjected to zakah. In the business context, there's a request to go one slide back. I hope that this one is sufficient, and this is the particular slide being referred to. I see I'm running against time. I may need a bit of time to elaborate and complete the presentation, inshallah. I'll try to go as swiftly as possible and complete it, inshallah. I hope that this is sufficient. In terms of receivables, loans, zakah is payable on loans in each year. The lender has the option to either pay annually or pay for all previous years upon settlement of the loan. So basically what we're saying is, if you advance the loan to someone, then the total amount constitutes a cash equivalent, and as a result would need to be subjected to zakah. The zakah can either be paid annually or whenever the amount is settled, the individual can pay the zakah, but then would have to pay back for the years that the amount was not subjected to zakah. Okay, there is a question regarding cattle produce. I may have to address this one a little later, inshallah. Please bear with me on this score. Credit sales, if any sales have been enacted on a credit basis, zakah is payable each year on the outstanding payments from trade stock. As long as that amount is not written off as bad debt, it would need to be subjected to zakah. Accrued income, any income that is earned but not yet received. So you earned it in terms of the accounting sense, but not yet received the amount. This would also have to be included in zakah on a business. Another common question, can I give my zakah to my husband or child who is in financial difficulty? A very common one. What I'll do is in the next slide, just go through the valid recipients that are mentioned in the Quran. I won't elaborate on each one. I'm just mentioning them to place on record that the Quran mentions these 8 individuals as a category, and then I'll respond to the question directly, inshallah. And this is done purely due to time constraints. But the faqir is the individual who has some wealth but insufficient for their everyday needs, qualifies as the recipient. Masakin possesses no wealth at all, qualifies as the recipient. Amilin, a zakah collector designated by an Islamic state. Mu'allafatul qulub, potential new Muslims who are given zakat to encourage entry into Islam. This is abrogated as per the consensus of Sahaba. Riqab is a slave who can be freed. Gharimin is an individual who's over indebted. Fi sabilillah refers to a needy individual while on Hajj, jihad, or pursuing a path of learning in the modern interpretation. Ibn Sabil is a stranded traveler without access to personal wealth. These days, even a traveler can access their wealth. So it only refers to a traveler who does not have access to their wealth. But in terms of the question itself, the question of whether zakah can be given to a husband or a child, this particular response is based on the Hanafi madhab. So zakah cannot be given to a masjid, it cannot be given to a disbeliever or non-Muslim, it cannot be given to a deceased estate, it cannot be given to a spouse. This is in direct response to the question itself. From a Hanafi fiqh point of view, a wife cannot discharge her zakah to her husband. A wealthy person cannot be a recipient of zakah. Similarly, zakah cannot be given to ascendants. In the Hanafi fiqh, one cannot discharge zakah to parents or grandparents. Similarly, zakah cannot be discharged to one's descendants, children, grandchildren, downwards. The rationale for this is that if one were to be allowed to give zakah to their ascendants or descendants, it is tantamount to keeping the zakah to oneself and not having discharged it. And this is why it is prohibited to discharge zakah. Keep in mind that while there's an emotional element to not being able to give zakah to one's children or husband who are struggling, zakah is not the only obligation in the Sharia. There are other forms of giving that are encouraged. And these should be implemented when it comes to our spouse or even ascendants or descendants. I must also emphasize that zakah can be given to in-law relationships, whether it's a father-in-law, mother-in-law, son-in-law, daughter-in-law. Those are not part of the mention of ascendants and descendants here. A Sayyid cannot receive zakah, and anyone from the Banu Hashim. If they have authentic link to any of these relatives, then they would not qualify as recipients of zakah. Question number 6, very common one. What if I don't have cash to pay zakah due to being unemployed? Keep in mind that not having cash, the short answer is that not having cash does not exempt an individual from zakah. The obligation still remains simply because in the eyes of the Sharia, the individual possesses wealth and hence zakah would be payable. So in essence, zakah is based on the balance sheet concept, not the income statement concept. It doesn't matter whether the individual is deriving income or not. It's based on what assets are reflected on that balance sheet. One may not have to have a formal balance sheet. I'm just saying that if an individual possesses zakatable wealth, zakah would be payable even though they do not have income. So zakah remains payable. The first option would be to discharge a portion of the actual wealth. So you calculate how much zakah is due, and a portion of the actual zakatable wealth is given away to the poor. So example, if a person has 200 grams of gold, then they would actually extract 2.5 grams of gold to be giving as zakah. If the individual has a cluster of wealth, different forms of wealth, then a valuable item worth how much zakah is due would be payable as option 1. Option 2 would be an item worth the zakah payable. So if zakah payable works out to 5,000 rand, then an item worth 5,000 rand is given away to the poor, and ownership is transferred between the payer of zakah and the recipient of zakah. Option 3 would be to record the zakah payable in an Islamic will, and whenever there's cash, then the zakah would be paid. If there is no cash and death dawns upon an individual, then there would be a wasiyah, and the zakah, unpaid zakah, would go out from 1/3 of the net estate. There's a question here about, is there any madhab that allows the wife to be able to give zakah to her husband? I am subject to correction on this one. As far as I understand, the Shafi'i madhab caters for it, but not the Hanafi madhab. I'm subject to correction. I need to confirm this with our Shafi'i desk. Question number 7, what if my jewelry was misplaced for many years? There are 2 rules that are important to bear in mind when it comes to zakah on a misplaced item. The first rule is that for any asset to be subjected to zakah, there needs to be ownership and possession simultaneously. It must be owned and possessed simultaneously. So if I use an example here, if an individual is an heir to an estate and is yet to receive their share, so there's this unnecessary delays and it's out of the control of the heir, but the estate is just not being wound up. Here you have a scenario where the individual owns a share in the estate, but does not possess the share. They cannot simply deal with that share as they please, simply because it's locked in an estate, it's not yet wound up. So in this case, because the rule is of ownership and possession simultaneously is not met, zakah would not be due on unpaid inheritance. Rule number 2 is the aspect of deemed possession. Deemed possession means that the individual voluntarily lodged their zakatable asset in an avenue where access to the asset is now restricted. So, for example, you have a voluntary pension fund or voluntary retirement annuity that the individual cannot access until the age of 55. So, in this case, even though the individual doesn't have possession, it may seem like it's contradicting rule number 1, but the mere fact that the individual voluntarily lodged it in this avenue would constitute deemed possession. It is as if the individual owns and possesses, and hence zakah would be payable. Now, the reverse of these two rules is the response to our question on misplaced jewelry. If the zakah if jewelry is misplaced and the individual has absolutely no clue where to locate the jewelry, in this case, the item is not, it may be in your ownership. Yes, you are the legitimate owner, but you do not possess that gold jewelry. And in terms of rule number 2, you have not voluntarily misplaced the jewelry. It was misplaced for some other rule of nature, and as a result, is not accessible. So zakah would not be payable on this jewelry for the period that it was missing. However, after it is found, it would only be zakah for subject to zakah for that current year if between finding the jewelry piece to the zakat date, the jewelry piece is still in one's possession. So it's possible that the individual found it in the year, but gave it away to their daughter who was getting married, maybe, or son who was getting married. And upon arrival of the zakah assessment date, the jewelry is no longer there. So in this case, the zakah would not be payable on that jewelry for the years that it was misplaced, as well as for that current year, because it was already discharged before the zakah date arrived. Can my husband pay zakah on my behalf? Very common question. As we know, there are 3 types of worship in the Sharia. We have the form of worship which is purely bodily. It's physical. And the example of that is salah. This form of worship cannot be deputized and cannot be passed on to another individual. The second form of worship is the one which is purely of that is our zakah. This form of worship can be deputized and it can be passed on to another individual. The third form of worship is the one which is a blend of physical as well as monetary. And an example of this is Hajj, where we exert ourselves physically and we also spend money. In this case, deputization is allowed under particular circumstances. So if we are talking about zakah, zakah can be deputized. The important thing to consider here is that the duty still rests on the individual. So the husband can take on responsibility to pay zakah, yes, but the primary duty would still rest on the wife in this case, and she would still have to be pursuing the matter and ensure that the zakah is eventually paid. What is important also is the consent, or what we call deemed consent. So consent either explicitly, where the husband asks the wife, can I pay your zakah on your behalf? And she gives consent, she agrees to it. Or there is history of the husband repeatedly paying year on year, paying the zakah on behalf of his wife. In this case, it would be regarded as deemed consent, and it would suffice for the husband to pay zakah on behalf of the wife. Question number 9. We are over time, but we should be done shortly, inshallah. As you can see, we are on question 9. If I pay zakah every month, is it acceptable? Many women have this practice of just charging a portion of their zakah on a regular basis, and then subject it to or determine whether the zakah is payable or completely paid or settled or not. There is a question here, how one pays zakah on a shared item, example, an item of jewelry of zakatable value, owned and shared between siblings. So This is a relevant question in terms of gold, zakah on gold. So in terms of the question itself of zakah on a shared item, this is a very relevant question. Zakah would be payable on the individual's portion of shareholding within that asset. So if you own half the jewelry piece, then half the value of that jewelry piece would be subjected to zakah. I hope that responds to the question. Coming back to question number 9, if I pay zakah every month, is it acceptable or not? It is acceptable, but there are particular conditions. Zakah can be paid, one can pay beforehand or prepay zakah, so to say. So you're paying every month and then at the end of the year, doing an annual recon. So it is permissible to prepay zakah, it's fine. As long as the individual is in possession of zakatable wealth. If you have the wealth upon which zakah is due, then zakah can be prepaid. However, it is integral to make a niyyah each time that zakah is being discharged on a monthly basis. One has to make a niyyah that zakah is being paid. However, keep in mind that when prepaying zakah, it does not absolve an individual of the annual reconciliation. The individual would still have a duty to calculate the zakah on the assessment date on an annual basis and determine whether they've underpaid or overpaid zakah. If they've overpaid, well and good, it is deserving of merit in the court of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If they've underpaid, they just need to make up the difference. There's a question here about if I have never had my Kruger Rand since marriage, it's missing. In the event that it is found, inshallah, does the same rule apply as the misplaced jewelry? Yes, the same rule does apply. I hope that the Kruger Rand is found one day, inshallah. The zakah would only be payable on the Kruger Rand for that particular year if, after finding it, the Kruger Rand is still in possession on the arrival of the zakah assessment date. There's a question about a pension fund with my job. I don't have access to it. Is it zakatable asset? In the case of this particular pension fund, since I gather it's an occupational pension fund, I haven't addressed it because we do receive it as a common question, but it's common between both males and females, so I've excluded it from the list of 10. But in the case of an occupational fund, as an occupational pension fund is not subject to zakah, and it comes back to the rule of ownership and possession simultaneously. To subject any asset to zakah, it needs to be possession, ownership and possession. In the case of an occupational pension fund, the pension fund is owned by the individual, but there isn't a true sense of possession in the eyes of the Sharia, where the individual can access the wealth at their own free will. There is red tape and bureaucracy in terms of accessing portions of that wealth, and hence zakah is not payable on the occupational pension fund. Question number 10, how do I identify a worthy recipient? This tends to happen, and in our personal experience, many women tend to prefer discharging their zakah personally, as opposed to giving it to an organization. And that is something encouraged. In terms of the Hanafi school, this is the criteria basically. We're basically going to look at cash in possession of the individual we are considering, gold, silver, zakatable assets in any investments, stock in trade maybe if they have, and any assets which are above their basic necessity. The individual could be struggling, but they have assets above their basic necessity. This is an important one to consider. So these are the total zakatable assets that we're going to look at before determining whether an individual qualifies as the recipient. Then we deduct liabilities, their liabilities. If after making the deduction, they are below the nisab rate, then they would be eligible to receive our zakah. So this is basically, in a nutshell, the criteria we use to determine whether an individual qualifies as a recipient of zakah. There's a request to make the slides and recording available to us. We will try. We cannot guarantee it at this stage, but we will try. In terms of determining a worthy recipient, there's no need to pry into personal affairs and dig deep into someone's or infringe their privacy to determine whether they qualify or not. It is sufficient to just suffice on what meets the eye or your general knowledge of the person. There's no need to disclose the status of money when zakah is being given. It can be given in the name of a gift or just as an ordinary handout instead of zakah explicitly. And it is important to consider relatives, but in considering relatives, bear in mind that ascendants, descendants, and one spouse from a Hanafi fiqh point of view do not qualify as recipients. This brings me to the end of our presentation itself. We have a case study, but we've exhausted our time. If we have consent, I can go through the case study quickly. It is the last 3 slides just to demonstrate the case study. Okay, there's a question about if you run a home industry, is zakah payable on home industry? I didn't get that question fully. If you run a home industry, will zakah be payable on packaging and ingredients? Yes, zakah will be payable on the packaging itself, because the packaging is something that is visible in the finished product. Zakah will be payable on that value. Packaging, if you think about it, adds value to the finished product. So the packaging material would need to be considered. The ingredients would be divided into 2 categories. The ingredients which are visible in your finished product would need to be considered for zakah purposes, and the ingredients which are not visible in the finished product would not have to be subjected to zakah. There's a question about, an earlier question about a person who made an investment in cattle produce. An amount of 25,000 was made. Do I pay zakat on cattle produce? In this particular scenario, you do not own the cattle itself. You would be paying zakah on the worth of the share if you have to liquidate it. So if hypothetically, if you contact the company and request them to pay you out, what's the amount that they would pay out after deducting any early withdrawal fees maybe, or any taxes if applicable? That value is what would need to be subjected to zakah. Not in this particular scenario, the zakah on livestock doesn't apply. It is the value of the investment that needs to be considered. And there's a question about, if you know someone is in debt, can you pay their debt as a form as a form of zakah? So there are a number of scenarios that can prevail in settling debt on behalf of an individual. So first of all, we determine that they definitely qualify. We need to firstly determine if they definitely qualify. And I provided the criteria earlier on in terms of identifying a worthy recipient. Once we've identified that they qualify as a worthy recipient, now we have the first option would be to give them, the first prize would be to give them the zakah, and then they utilize the zakah funds to settle their debt. So that's first prize. If there isn't a decent level of trust for the individual to appropriate the funds well enough, then what can happen is the individual you're considering as a recipient should appoint a third party as their proxy or their agent to receive zakah on their behalf and to allocate it where it is necessary. In this case, once the agency is in place, then zakah can be given to the agent, and the agent will appropriate the funds in favor of the debtor who qualifies as a recipient of zakah. I hope that responds to the question. Can zakah be paid to siblings? Yes, if the siblings, across all 4 madhahib, as far as I recall, if the siblings qualify as valid recipients, zakah can be given to them. Then there's a question on, is zakah liable on a deceased estate not as yet concluded? Valid question, very common also. Zakah, as long as the share of an estate is not paid out and the individual is trying their level best to exert pressure on the necessary individuals who have influence to wind up the estate, but there is nothing forthcoming and the share is not being paid out, zakah would not be due on an unpaid share of inheritance. It's a different matter if the heirs have voluntarily and collectively agreed to leave the estate as is and maintain a partnership going forward. In that case, then zakah would be payable on the individual heirs' share of the estate. But in the scenario where the estate is purely not wound up and as a result of some delays out of the control of the individual, zakah would not be payable on the share of the estate. Then we have a question with regards to home industry. If, for example, a person sells cakes, none of the ingredients like flour, sugar, eggs, etc. are actually visible in the end product. Does this mean that zakah does not need to be paid on these ingredients? Yes. The short answer is yes. Although these products as standalone items are make or break in terms of the finished product, but in terms of the rule that we have from our classical fuqaha, the zakah would not be payable on these items since they are not visible as standalone items in the finished product. Yes, if you have decorations in the home industry, then those decorations which are visible on the finished product would be subjected to zakah based on the current value of those items. We have a question about an investment. The question states, if I invested 10,000 Rand in shares 3 years ago, and the current value is 10,000 Rand, how much zakah do I pay? For a response on this particular one, I would have preferred that the individual send us an email so that we can explore the matter a bit in a bit more detail. But suffice to say that if those shares are being held in a market, in a share which is Sharia compliant, then the current market value of those shares would need to be subjected to zakah. That's a short answer. If there's a different motive for holding the shares, then I would need you to send us an email so that we can look a bit deeper into it and provide guidelines in terms of how zakah is calculated on share investments. There's a question here, I'm owed X amount by family for electricity. There is a claim against them in a court of law. Can this amount be deducted from zakah that is due? So I'm led to understand that I actually don't understand the question fully. I'll just rephrase what I do understand. What we're referring to is a scenario where an amount of zakah is payable, let's say 5,000 Rand. At the same time, we have an individual who qualifies as a recipient of zakah, and we are contemplating giving the zakah, or rather offsetting the zakah, the amount that they owe us with our zakah. I'm owed X amount by family for electricity. There is a claim against them in a court of law. Can this amount be deducted from zakah that is due? I would prefer not to venture into this question because I'm not fully understanding it. Maybe if the person asking the question can send us an email so that we can contemplate and maybe provide an answer. I'm just hesitant to provide an answer and confuse everyone by providing the incorrect answer. Another question here, what happens if you have no record or account of whether the deceased disposed of his or her zakah, what then is the procedure? Okay, so in essence, the scenario of an individual who passed on and there's no record of whether they paid zakah or how much they paid zakah. Keep in mind that if a deceased individual made a wasiyah for must zakah to be paid, then it is wajib upon the heirs to just charge zakah of that deceased individual utilizing estate resources, and a maximum of 1/3 of the net estate would be utilized for settling of unpaid zakah of the individual. However, if the individual passed on without making a wasiyah for must zakah to be paid, then zakah would not be wajib on the heirs. The heirs do not have a primary duty to be paying zakah on behalf of the deceased. If they choose to pay zakah on behalf of the deceased, it can be done. However, it would be voluntary. It would constitute a voluntary donation on behalf of the deceased, and we hope that it would alleviate the burden of the individual not having paid their zakah in their lifetime. Then we have a question that if I have bought shares in a Sharia-compliant investment company, do I pay zakah on the shares or on the quarterly returns I receive? This question depends on the nature of the investment company. If it is purely property and 100% property, in this case, the zakah would only be payable on the saved amount of dividends. However, if it is not property, it is ordinary, maybe stock market or unit trust, then zakah would be payable on the current market value of the shares if they were to hypothetically be cashed in. While we wait for any other questions, we do have a feedback form which we require to be filled and would appreciate to be filled out. This will be sent out in the next few minutes, inshallah. Please try to fill in the feedback form as honestly as possible so that we can improve on the delivery of services, inshallah. Another question is coming in here. I loaned money 4,000 to someone more than 20 years ago and has still not been paid back. Do I have to pay zakah for the past 20 years on this amount? The decision or the direction in this particular scenario rests very much with you as an individual creditor. If you have given up hope of receiving this amount, then zakah would not have to be paid on that 4,000 rand. However, if there is a reasonable amount of certainty that the individual would pay zakah and they would return the amount, they would settle the loan, then it would be encouraged to subject that 4,000 rand to zakah in each year. That would be the first price. Otherwise, whenever the 4,000 is paid, then pay the zakat for the past years for which the amount was outstanding. There's a request for the slides to be distributed to us. At this stage, we can't guarantee it, but we will try, inshallah. There's a question here. If I understand correctly, property investment, the property value is not zakatable, only the income received. This is correct. Zakah is not payable on the actual property value. Zakah is only payable on the income received or the saved amount of income received on a property rental. Hafiz Noor Kamal, you've requested to talk personally. You may contact us on our telephone number. The code is +27 11 373 8000. And we've reached the end of our session. We've exhausted our time. There's another question here about if I have zakatable assets, for example, gold, jewelry, and coins, but my debts are more than the value of gold, am I zakatable? Okay, so in this particular scenario, the individual would need to assess the total zakatable assets. We need to place all the jewelry on one pen of the scale or one side of the equation, all the coins, all the cash, and then deduct all the current portion of liabilities, not the full outstanding. If those liabilities are extending beyond a year, we only need to look at what's currently due or payable for the next 12 months. After we make the deduction, if the individual is in possession of an amount which is below the nisab rate, then they can receive zakah. If the amount is above the nisab rate, then zakah would still be payable by the individual, even though they have debt. Question here: my father paid my zakah on jewelry all my life. I know have cash in my possession. Can I only focus on my cash once it's equal to nisab? I'm not too clear on this particular question. It may seem clear, but there's a particular fiqhi nuance that I'm concerned about here. I would appreciate if you can email us details of this particular one so that we can respond, inshallah. Another question: is a retirement fund zakatable? If the retirement fund is occupational, in the sense that it is a work requirement, then the zakah, the retirement fund is not subjected to zakah. If it is purely voluntary, then it is regarded as deemed possession, even though the individual has no access to it. Due to voluntary subscription, one would need to subject that retirement fund to zakah. Another question has come in. If rental from a property is used to offset the loan required to purchase the property, is zakat still payable on that rental received? This is a good question in the sense that the rental being received is offsetting the loan, and hence there's no saved rental income. So if there's no saved rental income, there would be no zakat due in this case on the rental income. That's purely because the money is coming in and is used to offset a loan. Hence, there's no saved rental income and no zakah payable. Another question has come in, is zakah payable on gold or silver plated jewelry? How do I work out the value? The answer is embedded in the question in the sense that if the jewelry is plated, usually plated jewelry does not entail pure gold plate. It's imitation gold or imitation silver plating, and hence that plated jewelry would not have to be subjected to zakah. Obviously, it would be a different matter if the plated jewelry is pure gold. Then we would need to apply the value of the gold as at the prevailing zakah assessment date, and that value would be subjected to 2.5% of zakah. There was a question or a request to go back to the slide on valid recipients. I'm not sure if this is the slide being referred to in the request to display the worthy recipients. The email sent out. What about, we have a question here, what about provident funds taken out by the company where you employed? Is zakah due? It's not voluntary. Okay, in this case, zakah would not be due. Zakah would not be due on an occupational, any retirement product, be it a pension, provident or retirement annuity. If it is occupational based, requirement of the employer, it would not attract zakah. The question comes in as if zakah was initially discharged in one's first year of maturity, prior to a year passing, and thereafter one continued to pay zakah annually on that day, is the duty of discharging zakah fulfilled? Yes, the zakah duty seems to be fulfilled because the zakah, all the criteria are met in terms of zakah being due. And on the zakah assessment date, zakah was paid. So, according to what meets the eye in terms of the question, zakah would be fulfilled. If the question is not being adequately responded to, then please feel free to email us. But from the current presentation of the question, it seems like the zakah would be fulfilled, yes. The question reads, I was gifted a tea set should be worth 22 karat gold plated rims. Or worth play, okay. I was gifted a tea set with 22 karat gold plated rims. I used it maybe twice because I was unaware that it was gold. I have since disposed of it, but it was in my possession for a period of a time. Okay, so many a time these types of cutlery, we would need to determine whether they actually, the rim is actually pure gold or not. If it is pure gold, then yes, you would have to go back and pay zakah for the period of time that it was in one's possession. But then there would have to be an approximation now because we don't have a measure of calculation to determine what was the factual quantity of gold on those rims. Most cases that we encounter, those pieces of porcelain or utensils are not pure gold. They are plated, and hence they do not have to be subjected to zakah. I hope that the response is adequate in terms of the tea set. Then we have a question. My 5-year-old daughter owns jewelry. Do I have to pay on her behalf? From a Hanafi fiqh point of view, zakah is not payable on the wealth of a minor, irrespective of the reserve or quantity of wealth in their possession. From a Shafi'i fiqh point of view, zakah is payable on the wealth of the minor. It would need to be payable from the wealth of the minor. by the guardian or parent. But from a Hanafi fiqh point of view, zakah is not payable on the wealth of a minor. And if zakah was initially discharged, it's answered. Then we received another query. It was just a query about the fact that a year was not waited to pass before zakah was discharged. Jazakallah. Okay, so we have responded to that question. Jazakallah khair. Last question we received, what would be the best way to calculate zakah for past years? A portion was given out, but actual zakah amount was not calculated. In this case, we would need to be informed of the zakah assessment date particularly, so that we can start or commence from a particular date and then go back in terms of the items that were in one's possession, together with the particular liabilities that were applicable at the time. We do have a formula to calculate zakah for past years. I would request the questioner to email us with more details of the particular zakah assessment date so that we can use the appropriate values of gold or silver, and also to inform us of the particular assets that were in their possession so that we can calculate zakah of the past years. We've now exhausted our time in terms of questions. I'll just take the last one, as I've got a teaching commitment in a short while. The question is, if in error zakat paid was in excess of the amount, can it suffice for the next year, or must it be given as sadaqah? In this case, if an individual overpaid an amount, but made an intention that the amount that I'm overpaying would be considered for next year's zakah, in that case, when the next year's zakah is calculated, then the amount can be deducted. But if such an intention was not made and the individual just overpaid zakah, then post the event, the additional amount that was paid cannot be taken or construed as zakah for the current year. To conclude, I would like to thank all our participants for being with us. We hope that the session was beneficial and informative and helpful as well in terms of your personal implementation of zakah. Please feel free to contact our office for any further assistance. We do apologize for any utterances or any mishaps in the process of conducting this webinar. And we look forward to having your participation in future, inshallah. Jazakallah khair, and I do appeal to you to fill out the feedback form so that we can improve on the service being provided, inshallah. Jazakallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Saved it.